Hi everyone, this is a short screencast for Independent Colleges Dublin for CIMA E1 for November 2014. And in this particular screencast, we're going to be looking at supply chain management and indeed the recent developments in supply chain management. Now, before I deal with the scenario here, let me draw your attention to question 4 of May 2010 Part A, or if you're using the BPP text, then question 19A on page 17. Okay, so we'll deal with, in this particular screencast, just Part A here. And as I say, this really centers around what the current view, or perhaps more recent view, is of the supply chain and indeed the developments associated with that and how those developments can help a particular company. Now, in this particular case, we have W company, a white goods manufacturer that have had some issues in performance over the last few years. They have a replacement of their CEO, and the new CEO, JH, is suggesting that they should introduce some new techniques, for example, BPR and indeed process maps. It's clear from his review that the company itself is inefficient, it has higher costs than its competitors, and they're just sort of losing a bit of losing their position in relation to comparative or indeed competitive advantage. Final paragraph there just deals with ethical issues, which we won't be dealing with within this particular screencast, but I will follow up with another screencast on that particular area. Okay, so in terms of the requirements, really what are the developments? And indeed, what is supply chain management? I think the key thing to be clear on here is just the supply chain management just simply means the flow of just about anything, materials, cash and goods and services into a company, and indeed the flow outwards as well. Yeah, and really how changes or indeed developments recently could help this particular company. Okay, so that's really the nuts and bolts of the scenario. Let's have a quick look at the answer now to Part A, and what you'll see to a large extent is that the essence of this Part A answer to question 4 really relates to getting closer to suppliers, and indeed making that whole issue of the supply, whatever it is, good or service, etc., making that more of a strategic or strategically important aspect of the business rather than simply being price-based. And indeed, this first paragraph here really talks about operations management and the fact that this idea of the supply of, or indeed the flow of goods, services, cash, info, etc., is much more of strategic importance to businesses now, or indeed should be, and rather than looking at the supply issue from the perspective of price, they should look at really the relational procurement, and essentially that just simply means making the supplier issue much more important to the business. Okay. Now, in terms of the balance of the answer here outside of the first paragraph, to a large extent, this section of the answer and indeed the section below relates to just getting closer to suppliers. So rather than just simply dealing with purchasing as the buying in of materials and equipment, etc., really what we're looking at is really planning strategy and making the supply chain more strategically important. So not just planning, but also implementing a strategy in relation to the whole supply chain process. So literally everything that the entity receives in. Okay. Now, several points that they've made here. The first one is just this idea of this cross-functional approach, and really what that means is that we look at the sort of inputs or the movement of raw materials into the organization, and indeed the processing those materials into the finished goods, and then the movement out of those goods. So really what we're saying is that we have to look at all aspects of materials and indeed anything moving from really input phase to output phase. Okay. The other thing that's mentioned here in the second point is this idea of outsourcing. As you'd appreciate, what this sort of process requires a company to do is to look carefully at what they do and indeed what they're good at, i.e. their core competences, and indeed, perhaps what they're not good at, their non-core issues, and really outsource perhaps some of their non-core activities. Note that what you wouldn't do is outsource a core competence. In other words, something that you're very, very good at, you would tend to keep that in-house. Okay, so really, in essence, this paragraph talks about sort of reviewing activities with a view to outsourcing those to another supplier who may be able to do them more cheaply, more quickly, more efficiently. Okay. Next point is just in relation to suppliers again. This idea that certainly if you're going to look to leverage your competitive advantage, if you have a number of companies involved, perhaps you're looking to expand your supplier base, then that potentially lends itself to some difficulties. So what you need to do, one important aspect, is this idea of whoever you were dealing with, develop some element of trust and indeed collaboration amongst all your suppliers, and that's important to be up to speed in this particular area. Okay. Next point they look at is just efficiency. Again, some repetition here, but I think really what they're talking about specifically is things like structure. And this first point makes that point about the idea of the developments in the strategic supply chain management lending themselves to a more sort of flatter structure, a more sort of horizontal structure that focuses on the supply chain itself, for the benefit of the end customer. So rather than having a sort of a specialist divisions or indeed functions, we're looking at probably less people in the communications process. Next point is just the further reiteration of this idea of, they talk about upstream and downstream partners, indeed suppliers. It may well be that they decide to reduce the number of suppliers, and therefore the relationship between the management of those particular companies is very, very important. Okay. Final point that they make is just in relation to IT. And as you would expect, if we're looking to get closer to our suppliers, some form of integrated, joined up, as it were, IT or information systems is going to help. So rather than working with paper, we may well be working with some sort of EDI system where we're exchanging information through electronic means, perhaps in terms of inventory, etc. The next couple of points really relate to Porter and Cousins. We should be familiar with the value chain, Porter's value chain, and what it enables us to do. They do give us quite a bit of information about Porter's value chain here. I'm not so sure that all of it is overly relevant to us, because these CIMA answers, certainly the ones on the website, you'll find that they are a little bit of overkill, and they do mention that at the outset of each model answer set. So really a little bit more information they require. I think the important things here is that we understand, what does a value chain analysis do? Well, essentially it looks at activities. It looks at activities in the business. And we mentioned up above this idea of outsourcing. And certainly if we were to use Porter's value chain, really what we'd be trying to do is to really assess the activities that we undertake as a business, and really, if necessary, get rid of some. So really outsource perhaps non-core activities. And keep core activities in-house. The other thing that we'll be doing, is mentioned on the next page here, is just looking at the linkages between us as a business and indeed our suppliers. You'll see that mentioned within this paragraph here. And really the essence of Porter's value chain is identifying where we can be more efficient, either in terms of losing activities or perhaps combining activities. And indeed, over and above that, that word linkages is important. Not only linkages within our own value chain, but also within the overall value system. And you'll be familiar with that phrase value system, essentially being a set of value chains. So different suppliers being linked up. In other words, there are individual value chains being linked together. So there will be links between companies and indeed within companies. And what PVC, or Porter's value chain, effectively does is it encourages companies just really to be more efficient with their activities and indeed their linkages. Now, Cousins' strategic supply chain, or the wheel, is sort of similar. In essence, it talks about a variety of spokes in the wheel, as it were, in the supply chain wheel. And essentially what we're looking at is balancing of those spokes in terms of some sort of integrated approach. So again, it's not dissimilar to the value chain, and in essence, what it encourages a company to do is to look at all the elements in the value chain and to really ensure that those elements are balanced and therefore providing efficiency and indeed more comparative advantage. Okay, I hope that's helpful in terms of a quick summary on this particular area on supply chain management. That's a commonly examined topic, so do get a reasonable grip on it before you sit your exam. Many thanks.